Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. As I mentioned earlier, this is episode 27. With my bi-weekly release schedule, that means we have hit the 1-year anniversary of Welcome to Geektown. To celebrate that occasion, I have a special question from listener and personal friend Joel L., who asked me, I know that Speedball has played a huge role in your life. Is he still your favorite comic book character? Why or why not? Would you recommend new comics readers start reading his stories, or would you consider him more of an quote-unquote advanced user kind of character? First off, yes. He is definitely still my favorite comic book character. When I first learned of the character, I thought he was something of a joke, but as I read more and more of his appearances, I grew to identify with and appreciate him, and eventually reached the point where I declared myself the world's biggest Speedball fan. A title I have since had to defend successfully on a couple of occasions. As for the rest of your questions, I will get to those, but let me introduce the character to you all, since it's likely that you haven't heard of him, unless you're one of my listeners who also happens to know me in person. Let's dive into the history of Speedball, aka the Masked Marvel. He was created in 1988 by legendary artist Steve Ditko, who is also responsible for creating, among others, The Question and Blue Beetle for Charlton Comics, whose characters were later purchased by DC, and co-creating Spider-Man and Doctor Strange with Stan Lee in the early days of Marvel. After decades of not working at Marvel, Ditko returned, and, in addition to Speedball, also created Squirrel Girl, currently a cult favorite character. Ditko plotted and drew every issue of Speedball's initial series, which only lasted 10 issues. Speedball in many ways was a throwback to the Silver Age of comics, telling the story of a teenager who had acquired powers in a lab accident and semi-reluctantly fought various criminals, mostly unpowered or with minor technical enhancements, while trying to keep his identity secret, especially from his parents. In addition to the premise being somewhat retro, the storytelling itself was also a callback to an earlier time. Instead of 4 to 6 issue long stories, which was normal for the late 80s and early 90s, each issue was either one self-contained story or even split into 2 short stories. There were some ongoing story elements, but for the most part, after the first issue, which contained his origin, the books can be read in basically any order and still make sense. In this original series, we're introduced to Robbie Baldwin, an average teenager who was working as an intern part-time at Hammond Labs. While chasing down a cat named Niels, who belonged to one of the scientists, Robbie and Niels were bathed in extra-dimensional energy, which gave them each a kinetic field that surrounded them, and caused both Robbie and Niels to bounce, or things to bounce off of them when struck. This was accompanied by multicolored bubbles of light. While this field was active, Robbie would appear in a blue and orange costume, somewhat similar to the lab outfit he was wearing at the time. In addition, his voice sounded very different while in his Speedball form. When he first began, his transformation into Speedball was almost completely out of his control, as any impact could and would set this off. Complicating his life was the fact that in Springdale, Connecticut, the town he and his parents lived in, there was a law against any masked criminal or vigilante activity. Since his costume included a mask, Robbie was automatically breaking the law any time he transformed. While he slowly got better at aiming, for most of the series, Robbie relied more on luck than on skill to defeat the criminals he came across, bouncing around until he hit the right location. If what I've described sounds rather silly to you, you're right. As I said, this Ditko-era version of the character feels like it would be right at home with the early to mid-60s comics, and is easy to mock for its more simplistic story and art, and villains like the bug-eyed voice and the two-legged rat, especially compared to what else was coming out at the time. But it definitely has a certain charm if you're open to it. After his series was cancelled, Speedball continued to appear in Marvel's 2 anthology series, one bi-weekly called Marvel Comics Presents, and the quarterly book simply titled Marvel Superheroes. Most of these were still plotted and drawn by Steve Ditko, with a couple of exceptions here and there. He also was made a supporting character in Marvel's humorous take on post-superhero fight reconstruction projects, called Damage Control. Soon thereafter, Speedball was chosen to be one of the founding members of the new team Marvel put together, the New Warriors. It was here, under the writing of Fabian Nicieza and the pencils of Mark Bagley and then Derek Robertson, that Speedball really started to blossom and get some major character development. In issue 9, Robbie rescued his mother from an eco-terrorist group she had inadvertently joined and revealed his identity to her. The two continued to keep this secret from his father, as he was the district attorney of Springdale, and they were afraid that he would choose to turn his own son in. Much later, Robbie's dad did find out, and while he never really approved of his son's activities, he didn't turn him in or openly reject his choice to continue as a superhero. If you think you might enjoy coming-of-age stories and allegories to real-world issues mixed in with superhero action, then definitely check out The New Warriors Volume 1. Robbie's powers also developed during this time. He became much better at controlling his direction and found other ways to use his powers. Since his field redirects and enhances kinetic energy, he found he was resistant to temperature changes, as temperature is just the average kinetic energy of the molecules. And instead of bullets bouncing off of him, he learned to actually stop the bullets in their tracks by absorbing their kinetic energy and have them fall to the ground, much as Neo does at the end of the first Matrix movie, although Speedball did it years before. As his powers grew, he became more confident and sure of himself, although he remained something of a jokester and punster as he had from the beginning of the New Warriors run. Fabian wrote New Warriors for 50 issues, with writer Evan Skolnick taking over at that point, and artist Patrick Zurcher replacing Derek Robertson as the regular penciler after a few fill-in issues. Evan wrote 2 of my favorite Speedball-centric stories during his run. One was a story where Speedball appeared to die, but in some time-traveling shenanigans ended up being a cloned body of Speedball with the consciousness of a young man from the future inside. It makes sense when you read the story. The other is issue 66, where Robbie returns to Springdale after living in New York for a few years, and finds out that the strange villains who had plagued his early career were all connected to one mastermind. Zurcher's art on this issue is particularly great, calling back to Ditko's creations while still having a modern feel. Unfortunately, with the comic bust of the 2000s, New Warriors was cancelled. The book has come back briefly 4 different times, and Speedball has been in every volume except one. That version of the New Warriors had a very different premise, and only one of the characters had any connection to the original team. Often he was the impetus for getting the team back together. He's considered the heart of the team by his colleagues and by most fans of the book. His optimistic approach to life helps keep the team from despair in their dark times, of which there have been quite a few. One of the interpretations of the New Warriors, specifically Volume 2, was as a reality show, where the team would wander from town to town, fighting whatever criminals they could find, while also fighting amongst themselves, mostly due to the producers adding drama however they could. This team, including Speedball, found supervillains Cobalt Man, Coldheart, Speed Freak, and Nitro, hidden away in Stamford, Connecticut. And despite being overpowered, Robbie convinced the team to rush in and attempt to capture the group. Unfortunately, Nitro set off his power right next to a local school. The resulting explosion killed 612 innocent civilians, including 60 children. Most of the warriors lost their lives as well, with Speedball being the only survivor. This event was the impetus leading to the Civil War storyline in Marvel Comics. This also led to Robbie's powers changing and him taking on a new, incredibly dark and tortured identity called Penance, who was made a member of the government-run team called the Thunderbolts. Personally, I'm not a fan of this change, so I'm very happy to say that he has since recovered his original powers, although his time as Penance still colors how the character has been written ever since. Penance is practically a parody of the grimdark characters that were a staple of the post-Dark Knight/Watchmen era of comics, and it doesn't fit Speedball's character in any way, shape, or form. I prefer not to spend too much more time on this portion of Robbie's life, but since it is the event that most comic book readers associate with him, I would be negligent to leave it out entirely. Since his recovery, Robbie was a teacher at Avengers Academy briefly, then showed up in Volume 5 of The New Warriors, which only lasted 12 issues, but with Christopher Yost writing and Marcus Toe drawing, is the version that has felt closest to capturing the magic of the original team. Since that book's cancellation in 2014, Speedball hasn't been seen much in the comics, but hopefully that'll be changing sometime in the near future, as The New Warriors is still potentially set to be a TV show from Marvel Television. That roster includes members from Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the comics, in addition to characters who, up to this point, have not been associated with the Warriors in any way: Squirrel Girl and Mr. Immortal. The series was originally set to premiere on Freeform, but possibly could be one of the offerings on Disney's upcoming streaming service. In the so far unaired pilot, Callum Worthy played Robbie Baldwin / Speedball. It's still unknown if the series will eventually air, and the longer we go without news, the less likely it is to actually happen, but my fingers are still crossed at this point. So what was it about Speedball that drew me to him? Well, to begin with, I love an underdog. When I was first getting into comics, Speedball was mostly used as a joke by comic book fans and journalists, as the epitome of a failed character. Personally, I don't think any character is inherently bad, and Robbie in particular has a great deal going on with him that I saw as potential for some great stories. A character who grew up in the suburbs rather than the city, and one who had parents who put a great deal of pressure on him to realize their dreams for him, rather than his own dreams, was something I could relate to. And his powers, while seemingly pathetic at first, just need some practice and imagination to make him one of the most powerful people in the Marvel Universe. I mean, he can add and subtract kinetic energy from objects near him, meaning that he could move objects or stop them from moving. As I mentioned earlier, with the relationship between kinetic energy and temperature, he could make anything he wanted hotter or freeze it to absolute zero. He basically controls one of the fundamental forces of nature, like Magneto or Graviton, but because the effect is accompanied by neon bubbles, everyone laughs. He's gone through some horrible events, but like his namesake, he keeps bouncing back, usually with a smile. And that kind of optimism towards life is something we need more of in our heroes these days. Finally, Joel asked if I would recommend new comic book readers search down his story. I would say some of them. New Warriors Volume 1 is where I would start. One of the great things about the team is how they connect to various parts of the Marvel Universe, which makes them an excellent connective tissue for discovering other characters, making New Warriors a perfect book for people who want to dip their toes into comics and learn more along the way. And with only 2 writers and 3 main artists, the book is consistently well done throughout its entire 75-issue run. If you enjoy those books, then you can expand into other Speedball appearances, whether that be his solo title or other New Warriors runs. So, that's the long and short of my favorite character of all time. Do you have any other questions you'd like to hear answered? Or just want to send me a comment about the show in general? You can do so by sending an email to me at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council and help other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.